A slave gladiator had access to medical care that surpassed the quality of aid available to 99% of Rome's free citizens. It would be like a prisoner today receiving better treatment than a millionaire. Hollywood sold us the image of a disposable fighter, cannon fodder for the arena. But the truth was far more cynical. The reason wasn't humanism, but cold economic calculation. To his owner, the lanista, each fighter was a costly asset to be repaired, not discarded. The arena wasn't just a slaughterhouse. It was a brutal but perfectly calibrated business system. And that fact changes absolutely everything. It presents us with two key mysteries. First, why were slaves doomed to die fed a special diet and treated by the empire's best doctors, while millions of free Romans died from starvation and simple infections? And the second, even more paradoxical. How could a man at the bottom of the social hierarchy, a despised slave, simultaneously be an adored superstar and a sex symbol for whose company noble matrons paid a fortune? These two questions are the key to the gladiator's real survival code, and we are going to crack it. To understand the rules of this deadly game, we must return to the very beginning, to the market where human life first acquired its price. So the market. But who was this commodity? The Hollywood myth is simple. Only slaves, prisoners of war, and convicted criminals ended up in the arena. And yes, they formed the core of this stream. But reality was far more complex. By the beginning of the 1st century AD, nearly half of all gladiators were free citizens. Men who voluntarily sold themselves into slavery to step onto the sand. They were called octorati. They came to the same market as the slaves and stood on the same platform while a buyer inspected their teeth and muscles. But the purchase was just the first step. How the system selected and specialized this commodity reveals its cold economic logic. Why couldn't they just throw any strong slave into the arena? Why was there an entire industry for their selection if the ultimate goal was death? Because the lanista was not a slave trader. He was an investor. His selection system worked like a sieve. He would sift through thousands of captives, choosing not just the strongest, but those who fit a specific fighter type. The lightly armed retiarius, the heavy secutor, or the murmillo. This was complex logistics, not a simple purchase of manpower. From the moment of the deal, the person's life vanished. He became a number in a ledger, an asset whose value depended not only on his muscles, but on a far less obvious quality. And here is a fact that breaks all logic. The most valuable quality in a future gladiator was not physical strength. Yes, the lanista assessed height, age, and health, but this was just a basic filter. The stark reality was that the key criterion was entertainment value, charisma. Lanistas were looking not for fighters, but for artists of death. Men who could work up the crowd and put on a show. That is why the tombstone of the legendary gladiator Flama records not only the number of his victories, it also states that he received his freedom 4 times and voluntarily returned to the arena each time. He was too good an artist to leave. All these paths, coercion, conviction, or voluntary contract, led to one place. A place that was more terrifying than the arena itself. What is more terrifying? A deadly fight that might last 15 minutes, or the months of preparation for it. Any of these paths ended at the gates of a gladiatorial school, the ludus. The philosopher Seneca, describing life inside, did not mince words. It is pure murder. The fighter has nothing to protect himself with. It all ends in death. This was not a training camp. It was a factory for reforging the human personality. And it is behind these walls that we will now venture to see from the inside the mechanism that turned men into machines of entertainment and killing. What did a gladiator's typical day actually look like? Was it an endless struggle for survival, like in a prison block? No. It was a monotonous, grueling routine. Waking before dawn, hours of training at the post, a communal meal, and lights out on command. A strict, almost military-like regimen. But the historical sources hide one detail. The wooden training sword, the rudis, was twice as heavy as a real one. This was not about practicing technique, but about cultivating inhuman endurance at the very limit of possibility. Added to this was a total lack of personal space and constant surveillance. The only way to survive in this meat grinder was through a rigid hierarchy and an unspoken brotherhood. But how could trust arise in a place created to cultivate killers? A newcomer, a tyro, entered a hell where it was every man for himself. His first weeks consisted of mistakes, punishments, and brutal lessons from the veterans. However, practice showed the opposite. A so-called familia gladiatoria, or gladiatorial family, formed within the school. This wasn't a matter of sentimentality, but of pure pragmatism. Survival depended on training partners. They pooled their money to buy burial plots. The psychological turning point was the oath, the sacramentum gladiatorium, where a fighter swore to endure the whip, the brand, and death by the sword. From that moment, his old identity died. But for his body to withstand such strains and such an oath, it needed the right fuel. Were there elite schools for gladiators? Or were they all equally horrific barracks? At the top of this system stood the Ludus Magnus in Rome, the Harvard for fighters, connected directly to the Colosseum by an underground tunnel. To get in was a dream. But the reality was more complex. Archaeology in Pompeii and Carnuntum reveals a whole network of schools throughout the empire, with varying levels of prestige and specialization. It worked like a river system. Provincial clubs were small streams where talents emerged. The best of them flowed into the larger rivers of regional schools, and the most outstanding reached the sea, the imperial ludi of Rome. Even in these austere conditions, archaeologists find luxury items, expensive jewelry or pottery, gifts from wealthy fans. This was the first glimpse of their future star status. But to understand how to survive in this system, you must answer one question. Are you ready to trust those you might have to kill tomorrow? Imagine yourself in a newcomer's shoes. What would be the most difficult? The physical pain, the psychological pressure, or the need to trust a potential enemy? The three pillars of this system were iron discipline, constant pain from training, and a life lived in fear. But the heaviest trial was not the blow of a sword. It was the psychological paradox, the necessity of forming bonds of brotherhood with men you might have to fight to the death in the arena. The school broke the will to create the perfect fighter, but for his body to withstand this breaking, it needed a special kind of fuel. And this fuel completely shatters the image of the muscular warrior we know from movies. We have seen how they trained their spirits. Now we will learn what they fed their bodies. And this will change everything. The Romans gave them a nickname, hordearii, the barley men. Why were champions, whose bodies were their main instrument, fed the food of the poor, barley and beans, not meat? The first explanation is obvious. A high-carbohydrate diet provided a massive amount of cheap energy for training. But an analysis of the bones of 67 gladiators from a cemetery in Ephesus revealed a cynical truth. The goal of the diet was not to create chiseled muscles, but to intentionally build up a layer of subcutaneous fat. This fat layer acted as an airbag, protecting vital organs and blood vessels from shallow cuts. It made the fights bloodier, and therefore more spectacular, but less deadly for the fighter. Pure economics. But this diet had another, completely invisible yet critically important function. So the killing machines were vegetarians? Isotope analysis of their bones leaves no doubt. From a modern fitness perspective, This is a recipe for weakness, but the Romans, without knowing it, were using advanced biochemistry. The gladiators' plant-based diet was oversaturated with the element strontium. Modern research confirms that strontium, when integrated into bone tissue, acts like a special cement in a brick wall. It doesn't replace the main brick, calcium, but strengthens the entire structure, making it more resistant to impact and accelerating healing. Their vegetarianism was not an ethical choice, but a pragmatic technology, a form of natural doping that made their skeletons stronger. But even the strongest bones sometimes broke, and that's when medicine stepped in. Imagine dinner in the ludus. A newcomer looks with disgust at his bowl of barley porridge, but a veteran points to a cup of murky gray liquid. This was their secret weapon, described by Pliny the Elder. A drink made from plant ash mixed with water. It tasted disgusting, but it was a powerful source of calcium and minerals needed for bone recovery after microtraumas from training. Here, food was not pleasure, but fuel and armor. Another step in turning a man into a machine. But this armor of fat and strong bones often failed. And that's when men whose art was almost magic entered the scene. The diet was a brilliant and cheap first line of defense. It increased both survivability and spectacle. The system seemed perfect. But reality hit hard. The skeletons of gladiators bear witness to horrific injuries. Pierced skulls, shattered joints, deep wounds from Aretiarius' trident, against which a layer of fat was useless. What happened when an expensive investment sustained such damage? This brings us to the answer to the main question posed at the very beginning. We will look inside the gladiatorial school's operating room, a place where medical miracles occurred. And we will understand why a slave received what free citizens could only dream of. How is this possible in a world without antibiotics and anesthesia? Each school had its own medicus, or doctor. This was often a highly educated Greek, like the famous Galen, who began his career in just this way. But the skeletons from Ephesus tell another story. Forensic examination shows evidence of successfully healed multiple fractures, healed wounds on skulls that would have been fatal for any other person of that era. Gladiator doctors were not just good physicians. They were pioneers of sports medicine and traumatology. Their daily practice gave them unique knowledge. But what specific, sometimes shocking methods did they use to defeat death? What secret weapon did ancient doctors have against the main threats? Infection and unbearable pain? Their arsenal looks surprisingly modern. Washing wounds with wine or vinegar, using only clean linen fabrics, and cauterization to stop bleeding. But their theory was completely different. Galen, like others, believed in the concept of laudable pus. He mistakenly thought that the formation of pus was a good sign of healing. Archaeology confirms this. In the house of the surgeon in Pompeii, over 40 bronze instruments from scalpels to bone saws were found. Surgeries were made possible by powerful painkillers, opium, and henbane. But even the best medicine did not guarantee survival. It only offered a chance that turned scars into marks of distinction. What did a wounded gladiator feel on the operating table, knowing his life depended on a man for whom he was just a thing? Imagine a veteran brought to the doctor after a fight. His world is pain, fear, and resignation to the procedure. But the doctor shows no empathy. He acts like a mechanic repairing an expensive machine. Quickly, efficiently, emotionlessly, the veteran survives. But a terrible scar, a cicatrix, remains on his body. And this scar becomes his medal, proof that he was at the brink of death and returned. It dramatically increases his value and popularity. Does this mean that surviving a fight was not a miracle, but almost the norm? If gladiators were treated so expensively and effectively, it means they shouldn't have been constantly dying in the arena. So what was the point of the games, if not death? The entire system, diet, training, medicine, was tuned to preserve the fighter's life. It was a profitable business model. And here's the number that changes everything. Contrary to Hollywood, the chance of a gladiator dying in a fight in the 1st century AD was not 50%. It was only 10 to 20%. This means a gladiator had an 8 out of 10 chance of walking away from the arena alive. This figure proves that we have been looking at everything the wrong way. It means the fight was not a chaotic slaughter, but a strictly regulated sport, with its own rules and referees. And now, we will prove it. How can we reconstruct the rules of a sport that disappeared 1,500 years ago? At first glance, mosaics and reliefs show only chaotic carnage. But look closer. In almost every depiction of a fight, there is a third person, dressed in a tunic and holding a staff. This is the referee, the summa iudis, and he is not just an observer. His authority in the arena was absolute, like a scale where one wrong move by a fighter could instantly tip the balance toward punishment. He could stop the fight, separate entangled weapons, or issue a warning for passivity. His word transformed 2 killers into 2 athletes. And here's the rule that changes everything. A gladiator was not allowed to strike a fallen opponent without the referee's permission. This was deadly chess, not a slaughter. And the most recognizable gesture of antiquity, the emperor's thumb pointed down, is most likely a myth. It comes to us not from Rome, but from a 19th century painting. Sources speak of police verso, which means not thumb down, but turn thumb. The signal for death was likely a thumb pointed to the side, mimicking a sword thrust. The sign for mercy, missio, was a thumb hidden in a fist, a symbol of a sheathed sword, and this gesture was granted more often. The chance of dying in a fight in the 1st century was comparable to the risk of a Roman woman dying in childbirth. It was a dangerous job, not a death sentence. What did the crowd see? Not a clash of 2 beasts, but a tactical game. A newcomer, the Tiro, deafened by the roar of 50,000 people, fought instinctively, relying on brute force and quickly tiring. But a veteran behaved differently. He didn't hear the crowd. He heard the crunch of sand under his opponent's feet and the whistle of air from his sword. He conserved his energy, looked for weaknesses, used feints. This was his job. When a defeated fighter raised his index finger, it was not a gesture of cowardice. It was an official admission of defeat according to the code of the arena. He was surrendering his fate into the hands of the referee and the spectators. Have you ever admired an athlete, knowing they were risking their life? So the picture has been turned upside down. Instead of a merciless slaughter, we see a complex, regulated sport. The rules protected the owner's investment, and mercy allowed the audience to see their favorites again and again. Everything was designed to keep the show going. But this discovery does not solve the main paradox. It only sharpens it. If these were just slaves, talking tools, why did the crowd love them so much? How could a person legally equivalent to a thing become an icon and an object of adoration for all of Rome? We have solved the mystery of the arena. Now we face the mystery of Roman society.
Archaeology in Pompeii gives us our first clue. Over 20% of the graffiti in the gladiators' barracks was left by women. What compelled noble matrons to sneak into a slave's dwelling? At first glance, it seems like simple fan adoration. Inscriptions like, Celadus the Thracian, the sigh and joy of the girls, paint a harmless picture. But the Roman poet Juvenal shatters this illusion. Noble women paid lanistas enormous sums for the right to spend a night with a famous fighter. It was the height of a scandalous trend. The sweat and blood of gladiators were scraped from the arena and sold in vials as a powerful aphrodisiac. Juvenal described how a senator's wife, Epia, ran off to Egypt with a gladiator named Sergius, whose face was disfigured and arm was broken. That is how powerful their appeal was. And this explains why their faces were known to everyone, even those who had never been to the arena. How did a common Roman, who couldn't afford a ticket to the games, know the names of the best fighters? Their fame was not confined to the walls of the amphitheater. It was the result of an entire media industry. Their images were everywhere. On pottery, children's toys, frescoes in taverns. Poems were composed about them. Their names were shouted in the streets. They were the heroes of the first sports news. A gladiator's fame spread like fire through a dry forest. The fight in the arena was the spark, and the souvenirs, graffiti, and rumors were the wind that carried the flame throughout the empire. For the lanista, this popularity was a set of golden shackles. The more famous the gladiator, the higher his price and the stronger his enslavement. What did a man feel, being simultaneously at the pinnacle of fame and at the bottom of society? In the market, merchants made way for him. Children looked on with admiration. This side of fame gave the illusion of power and importance, but in the barracks, it bred envy and deadly competition. In the arena, it turned into unbearable pressure. The crowd expected only victory, but the cruelest blow was dealt by the law. Despite universal love, a gladiator had the status of infamia, a man of dishonor. He was stripped of basic civil rights. He could not make a will or testify in court. Even the most famous idol of millions could not give evidence against a simple baker. The key to their ultimate dream lay not in fame or money, but in a simple piece of wood. So we have pieced together the image of a living paradox. The gladiator was a despised slave and an adored icon. His star status was an integral part of the Colosseum's economic machine, both a privilege and a curse. It gave him access to luxury, but bound him more tightly to the arena. This career could not last forever. The body aged, new competitors emerged. So what did every gladiator dream of as he fell asleep in his cramped cell? Dozens of victories, thousands of fans, but only one true goal. We will finally reach it. The most coveted object in the world of the arena. The wooden sword, the rudies, a symbol of freedom. And we will find out the price of that freedom, and what truly awaited a fighter after he left the sand for good.
How could the ultimate reward for Rome's most dangerous fighter be not a bag of gold, but a crudely carved piece of wood? Here it is, the peak of a career. A veteran stands in the middle of the arena, the crowd chanting his name. The emperor hands him a wooden sword, the rudies. But this is not a happy ending. It is the beginning of the most terrifying choice of his life. He feels the rough texture of the wood in his palm. The sword weighs no more than a couple of pounds, but it feels heavier than his entire past life. The first path, to leave, to become a free man, but with the stigma of dishonor, without a profession, with a maimed body unsuited for the world. The second path, to stay, to give back the rudies and become a trainer in his home school, retaining his status and income, to remain a slave in golden shackles, forever trapped in the system that created him. Why would a lanista ever let go of his most valuable asset? Because the very hope of freedom was a powerful motivational tool. The term seemed achievable. A gladiator could be eligible for a rudis after 3 to 5 years of fighting, or 10 to 15 victories. This created the illusion of a fair deal, but the numbers shatter this illusion. An analysis of epitaphs on tombstones shows that the average age of death for a gladiator was 27. 9 out of 10 newcomers who walked through the school gates never saw their 30th birthday, let alone freedom. The rudies was a carrot dangled on a stick. Even the few who gained their freedom often returned. They couldn't adapt to a life where they were despised. The arena, once a prison, became their only home. What happened to a man whose profession was legalized killing? when he finally did leave. The most obvious path was to become a trainer, a doctor at his school. A veteran possessed invaluable survival experience. But there were other options. Their skills were in demand. Some became bodyguards for wealthy Romans. Mark Antony had a personal guard of former gladiators. Others became referees, summarudes, at the games. Most poignantly, there are their tombstones. Having lived to old age, they would proudly list their former profession in number of victories. Leaving the arena was like an amputation. They lost a part of themselves, and this phantom pain kept them close to the world of combat for the rest of their lives. Freedom, death, or eternal service to the arena. We have considered the three main outcomes, but which one was the real end? None of them. Because a gladiator is not just a fighter. He is the central element of a highly complex system. The Lanista's cold calculation, the crowd's thirst for spectacle, the political ambitions of emperors, advanced medicine, diet, and media fame. All are parts of a single mechanism. It turned death into entertainment, slaves into idols, and cruelty into a profitable business. And when we look at this system as a whole, we understand that the story of the gladiator is a mirror. In the finale, we will assemble all the keys to his survival code. And we will understand how this ancient system is connected to the modern world of sports and entertainment. And what it says not so much about the Romans, but about ourselves. At the very beginning, we asked a question. Why were slaves doomed to die fed and treated better than free citizens? Now we have the answer. The key to the survival code is cold economic calculation. The gladiator was his owner's primary investment, and protecting that investment determined everything. Advanced medicine was not an act of humanism, but a way to get a valuable asset back in working order faster. The barley diet was not about health, but a cheap method to build a protective fat layer for spectacular but non-lethal cuts. Strict rules in the arena and a low mortality rate were insurance against the loss of valuable fighters. A top gladiator was worth over 1 million sesterces. With that money, you could buy 500 tons of grain and feed all of Rome for a day. The entire system was built not on cruelty for cruelty's sake, but on the maximum capitalization of human life. But if it was all about money, where did the almost religious adoration of the crowd come from? This brings us to the second paradox. The slave superstar. And he, too, was no accident. He was the necessary fuel for the economic machine. The crowd's need for heroes, spectacle, and sex created a cultural phenomenon that the Lanistas learned to monetize. The status of an icon and sex symbol transformed a fighter from a slave into a valuable brand. This allowed them to sell merchandise, arrange paid meetings with female fans, and raise the stakes on fights. Fame was a marketing tool. It benefited everyone except the gladiator himself. The Lanista got more money. The crowd got their idols. Politicians got the loyalty of the masses. And the gladiator got golden shackles. More privileges, but also more pressure. And a stronger dependence on the system. A gladiator's fame was like a tide controlled by the Lanista. He would raise the wave of popularity before the games, only to collect the maximum profit on the shore afterward. At first glance, this world seems infinitely distant from us. But if you remove the swords and sandals, you see striking parallels. The arena never disappeared. It just changed its form. Modern MMA fighters or boxers risk their health for fame and money. Their careers are short, and their contracts belong to promoters who take the lion's share of the profit. They are modern gladiators. Elite sports medicine that restores athletes after severe injuries. Special diets for maximum performance. A media industry that turns athletes into brands. Strict rules and referees that make a dangerous sport palatable to the audience. We have identified at least 4 elements of the Colosseum system that operate in sports today: elite medicine, star marketing, strict rules, and enormous profits for the owners. The legacy of the Colosseum is not the ruins in Rome, but the very model of the entertainment industry. Have you ever considered who really benefits from your favorite sports shows? We have walked the entire path, from the slave market to the wooden sword. We have dissected a system that both elevated and destroyed a person. We have seen that the gladiator was neither a will-less sheep led to slaughter, nor a ruthless killer. The reality was far more complex. Now that you have all the keys, it is time for the main question. A question not about Rome, but about us. After everything you have learned, who is the gladiator to you? A person who fought for his life and dignity in inhuman conditions? Or a cog in a cruel entertainment machine? Write just one word in the comments. Your final verdict. Hero or victim? There is no right answer, but your choice will show what in this ancient story resonated with you today. Thanks for watching. The discussion is in the comments.